Aaman, thank you so much for joining me. I'm wondering, before we get going here, did you hear the news that just came out of France right now?
No, what?
There was an explosion at the cheese factory. There was debris everywhere. Debris everywhere. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
Quel horreur to take that further, right? Quel horreur.
I like it. Oh, very cheesy. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and you are listening to What Magic Is This, a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. And my goodness, we are continuing with the Books of Magic series. So we just finished talking about the Book of St. Cyprian, particularly the Portuguese version of that. And on this one, we're going to talk about something that I don't think has been covered comprehensively in any podcast to this day. And I am so excited to jump into this topic because this is such a fascinating, and I'm not just saying that, this is a truly fascinating period of time and phenomena that we're going to be looking into. I can't wait to go into it because I have the perfect guest. So let's get into it. My guest is a researcher, occultist, and student of magic, astrology, and philosophy, as well as a computer science professional. He has published the definitive edition of the complete illustrated Grand Grimoire, as well as 2 collections of poems, as well as the just released translation of the Grimoire Welcome MS 983 L'Art Magique, or the magical art. Served well by a lifelong fascination with France and the French language, I am beyond pleased to be speaking about Bibliothèque bleue with the one and only Aaman Lamba. Aaman, how are you?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. I've loved listening to your excellent conversations over the years. I think it's really opened up a huge space of ideation, conversation, talking about books. But yeah, I'm most excited that we're talking about not just a book, but the whole genre or the field of popular, let's say, literature, which almost these were, right? So looking forward to this. Thank you.
No, thank you for being here. Let's jump right in, because something that people might come across is they'll be reading a book or something like that, and they'll see 2 words mentioned side by side, and that is Blue Grimoire. And in this case, we're going to be talking about Bibliothèque bleue. It basically means, it translates entirely as Blue Library. We'll just call them Blue Grimoires, or in this episode, Bibliothèque bleue. Aaman, what were Bibliothèque bleue?
Okay, so here's what happened, right? In France, for various reasons that maybe we can get into later, there was always a fascination with the written word. And while, a lot of knowledge was, so to speak, lost or hidden away, they continue to be a study of, in the academic somewhat circles from the 1300s and in Central Europe, right, and especially in France. And the kings, especially the later Louis, really encouraged and fostered this, right? And that continued all the way to Napoleon with his encouragement of the library and so on. Now, in about, I think for about 250 years, it became a huge deal, right? The popular culture from 17th to mid 19th century France, people were hungry for content. And a couple of brothers who were part of, so to speak, the royal circuit, if I might call it that,
Sure.
Decided to start, producing content in this area, right? And so they produced well over 2,500 volumes in what's called the Bibliothèque bleue, and they were from the city of Troyes and in France. They produced these in very simplistic forms, right? They were printed on poor, cheap paper. They were a poor stock, so that most of it is decaying. Fortunately, there are some groups that are actually digitizing them now. But the whole value proposition was they were highly easy to produce. They were low quality paper bound in blue covers, which is where we get the Bibliothèque bleue. And so they were handed out, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this, by peddlers, right? But they were portable. They were the size of pocketbooks, right? They were extremely popular topics such as romances and cooking and farming tips and etiquette manuals, a lot of popular fiction, and also there was always this interest in kind of religious literature and what we now call occult literature, although that really wasn't the term back then.
Right.
And somewhere along the way, some notable people started contributing, or really there was no real sense of copyright. They started publishing these books in that library, right, in the Bibliothèque Blue, and so that became hugely popular, right? Apart from the medieval romances, these Blue Grimoires were really a subset, right? It's hard to say which were definitely published, but the most popular, of course, were the Petit Albert, the Grand Albert, the Dragon Rouge or the Red Dragon, and so on, right? And then there was a lot of something very interesting is one of the most popular was a book called the Juan de Bordeaux, right? He was a knight, right? And somebody who ruled Guyenne. Now, he in himself, you might say, so what, right? But he seemed to have a lot of adventures, and he came in contact with Oberon and stuff, right? So there's many versions of this. I'm really happy to share, and maybe at the end I'll come back to this, that my next book is going to be a translation and an edition of Juan de Bordeaux and other related works called The Song of Oberon on Papaveria Press, really an imprint of Hadean Press. So we'll talk about that, but definitely. I think kind of bringing back the Blue library slowly, as it were, to the modern age.
That's fascinating. Yeah, people loved these books. A lot of times they were almanacs, as you mentioned, a lot of things to do with living day to day. As you said, there was a subsection of these that were very definitely what we were going to call books of magic. For lack of a better term, they're grimoires. And one of the champions of Blue Grimoires, somebody that we're probably going to talk about a few times during this episode, is the late great author Jake Stratton Kent. He loved Blue Grimoires, and he made this observation. I just love this observation. The fact that we call books of magic grimoires is not some academic term. It's because of these Blue Grimoires that we call pretty much all books of magic now grimoires. Although the term comes from hard to read book, which a lot of times these grimoires were, the fact that a lot of these Bibliothèque Blue grimoires have the term grimoire in their title, which is why we call all books of magic now grimoires. Great answer. I have to ask you, what was the spiritual and political climate like in France around the time in which Bibliothèque Blue started to become popular?
Oh, that's a great question. That entire period, right, the 250 years, it was like 7 seasons in one day, right? One day it would be a shift towards absolute monarchy, and the next, kings were losing their heads, and as Napoleon said, that head rolled down, and he just picked up the crown and put it on his head because no one was, looking, right? And so there was the political climate, fluctuated a lot, right? In fact, I should say the spiritual climate also fluctuated. There were these big religious conflicts, the Wars of the Roses, the Catholics and the Huguenots or the Protestants were like kind of facing each other. The Catholic Church, of course, had dominance, and that led to a lot of, I won't say suppression, but formalization of, certain forms of thing. And the Pope just yesterday, Pope Francis had this whole diatribe against, right, occultism and magicians, neglecting the fact that the Vatican Library probably has the best collection of magic.
I know. There's like, right? give them to me. I'll take them. I've got another bookshelf, right?
Right. And essentially, the church is licit magic as opposed to what we might consider illicit magic. So yeah, that's another thing, right? But the interest in, during both the absolute monarchy and the Enlightenment period, which came right after that, towards scientific research, mysticism, occultism, ensured that these books continued to be popular beyond, just say, peddlers selling it. Almost everyone had access to versions. And of course, as today, there were better produced versions and hard, leather bound and stuff like that. But the Blue Grimoires continue to stay popular all through the revolutionary upheaval, into the 19th century. Yeah.
There's an interesting thing that occurred in France. Can you tell people about the affair of the poisons? Do you know about this?
Oh, yes. So this happened in fact, it lasted quite a few years, right? Yeah. It was from about 1677 to 1682. Yeah. It drew in a lot of people, right? A lot of people got kind of arrested. It was during, of course, Louis XIV, period, the Sun King, and it had a lot of, it's hard to peel, that very complicated onion. But a lady, and Madame de Brimoyer, was arrested, and she was accused of poisoning her father and brothers, right? And that she seemed to have access to some of these texts, and she seemed to have alchemical texts. And so they basically began a whole investigation. They set up a special chamber de Ardent, I think, to bring in people and start interviewing them. And what they found is, much as we might expect, there was a lot of interconnectedness, right? These guys were diddling each other, to use a term, right?
Yeah.
And they had, there were a lot of nobles were involved. Now, as you might expect, they were also surrounded by a network, right, of fortune tellers, alchemists, poisoners, literally poisoners, right? And the nobility used these. Now, they were accused, of course, and hard to say, of using black magic to do these things. I mean, again, it was chemistry plus maybe some magic, right? And so it created a climate of suspicion and paranoia and research. Now, the Blue Grimoires, or the Bibliothèque Blue, took advantage of this, right? Many books were published that were literally talking about that exact topic, and spiraling the excitement and crime, the passion, and pamphlets, and literally people wanted to read what were these things that people were trying, right? How were they using them? And so it became extremely popular, and so that had a huge impact. It became a sensationalized way of, in fact, I'd say it was one of the first public ongoing interest in dramatic events, and nothing they had anything to do with, but now they wanted to talk about it, and broadsheets as well were being published. So it had a ripple effect till today, I'd say.
The Affair of the Poisons is one of those things that over the last 500 years, magic and the occult hasn't really been in the spotlight too much. But the Affairs of the Poisons was a national scandal. It was one of those things where even people that lived rurally, in some way had an inkling of what occurred during this period of times. It was a big thing. As much as I'd love to keep talking about it, I will at some point be touching on the Affair of the Poisons. Probably it might be a solo episode for myself, but it's just one of the most fascinating periods of time in France. Really incredible. So I have to ask you, who were colporteurs, and what was it that was special about their hustle?
Sure. So if you think about it, right, the traditional, like, cities were a very central aggregation point, and you might expect cities had larger stores or even bookshops, but most people were not in the cities. They were, very rural. They had limited access to, large stores. And so they got most of their news, they got most of their, items that they were interested in, maybe knickknacks or newer fashions, from peddlers, right? Colporteurs quite literally means, col is really neck, right? So colporteur, carrying something around the neck. Right. And so they have this whole box or bag and stuff in it, and they'd sing. So almost like the Pied Piper image, but they would go from town to town and bring news, gossip, but also carry books, right? And again, these pocket books of the Bibliothèque Blue were easy enough. They could stack 20, 50 of them in a small box and carry it or put it on their cart. And so they were really itinerant peddlers that brought literature directly to the people who almost would never have had access to it, right? They didn't, they wouldn't even be allowed, most likely, into the large monasteries and bibliotheques and stuff. So this was really important. They, of course, mixed it with medical texts and popular fiction and knickknacks and stuff. Now, something interesting is they adapted their offerings. A lot of them were named colporteurs who were sued because they were selling, remedies that didn't work and stuff.
Snake oil merchants, yeah.
Exactly. They were literally the itinerant snake oil salesmen.
Yeah.
They got around it by repackaging these books, right? Changing the covers, changing the names, adding, a few pages here and there, which is interestingly why we have this diversity of grimoires, right? You have text one and somebody adds another page and just calls it something else. And so now suddenly it's no longer the banned book, just like you might have today.
Yeah.
Many of the books they were selling or offering were on the Vatican banned list, the Librum Prohibitorum, and there were other French laws that banned books. So, but they introduced this concept of book distribution. What's interesting though is, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, that principle translated very well to the Americas, right? Peddlers became a norm of pushing books and texts even in Americas, and there's Mark Twain has characters of that nature and so on. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. What's fascinating about this period of time and is that this 250 period of time saw the largest explosion of literacy within rural areas in France. Like of course, some people would just be like, well, it was because of the Enlightenment and whatnot, but a lot of it has to do with these itinerant colporteurs that would be bringing these books and people would want to read. It created, and this might sound very simplistic, but beforehand, the need to read wasn't a thing that allowed you to get through the day. But what these people, these peddlers did is that they instilled a passion and a want for people to take part, as they would have these books and people would want these books, or they'd see other people with these books, and it would spur people in to want to become literate. It's really quite incredible. And of course, we're never going to have statistics as to like just how literacy spread in that period of time. But everybody says that because of these very cheap paperbacks and the people selling them, literacy shot through the roof in rural areas of France. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was looking at something else that these peddlers were really accused of. As you might imagine, they were accused of carrying around a kind of intelligence network, right? Passing information, again, during those days where literally no one trusted anyone. Maybe no one trusts anyone today, but they were the ones who were, yeah. So when they were charged with violating church laws, but also a kind of, like an underground network that kind of became a way of passing, not just books, but, kind of counterfeit and subtle information messages. Yeah. So a lot was going on.
Everybody knows about cunning folk, particularly those that listen to my podcast, but a lot of the colporteurs would also be somewhat aware, particularly the ones that sold blue grimoires, would be aware of the content within a lot of these grimoires. And they would, as like a little tease, the first dose is always free. It's always free by the dealer. They would know a little bit about the magic within their books, and they'd tell people, but they'd be like, but if you want a bit more of that, you have to get the book kind of stuff. So they were salesmen, snake oil merchants in a way in a bit, but they were like traveling cunning folk book salesmen. It's just such a very fascinating thing, and I absolutely love it. Why do you think that blue grimoires were so popular?
So if you think about it, again, going back to the people who were really interested in them, they didn't have access to formal libraries and the academic forms, right? This was primarily folk rituals, folk magic. It dealt with topics that they were very interested in, such as, love and protection or destruction, as it were, right? And it was written in very colloquial language. It wasn't intended to be very heavy, kind of church Latin and stuff. So they were literally in colloquial French, and French, as it were, has somewhat survived, right? I mean, when I was working on the magical art, a couple of the books I referenced were the very first and second editions of the Dictionnaire Français, and I was surprised because those words still are in use today. It's just, maybe additional examples have got added as time has gone by. So people were using that. They were very visual. There were a lot of them were illustrated, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
They had images of talismans. They had magic circles. They had tools. So that also was really a form of artistic kind of creativity. And so, I mean, people had access to that at hand. Like never before, right? And so even if they couldn't read a lot of the text, they could kind of follow the picture, and kind of follow through, and that led to more, popularity. I mean, the not quite the Petit Albert, but a couple of the other grimoires are a bit more focused on amulets and images. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. We're enchanted by the visual aspect of these things, and by turning the pages. And of course, if one's able to look at some blue grimoires, and I'll have a link to quite a few of them in the show notes for this episode. you can just imagine people coming across these, and even if they can't read for the first time, there's knives and there's magic circles, and there's as Aaman said, that there's these talismans that just look magical. That's kind of why we're all here and doing this magic stuff. This looks enchanting, it looks magical, and it looks cool, so that people want to be part of that. Let's talk about the content of these. So what makes Blue Grimoires different from the more scholarly or handwritten manuscripts that we come across?
So, they represented a transmission of ancient knowledge, right? Or at least they claimed to, right?
They claim.
Essentially, the content was centered around invoking spirits and, using magical symbols. There wasn't a lot of explanation or theory. This wasn't a Skinner, text with excellent, footnotes and appendices. This was the Hobbit of the day, not the the appendices to the Lord of the Rings, right?
Got it.
So that was the thing, and they were, of course, practical, right? So there was almost all of the versions of the Grand Grimoire come with a collection of secrets, right, or practical charms to make a woman, or assuming a man, dance naked, or kind of run faster than with like the 7 league boots. So there was also this the fays, the conte de fays, the fairy tales were very, very popular in that in the field of the Bibliothèque blue, right? And there's almost no differentiation between those and little more formal text. So this wasn't very academic. It was very popular context. There were a lot of folk traditions. And again, simplified and adapted. Many of them were adapted, right? And that led to a lot of, again, innovation. And I'm assuming people creating their own, copies and stuff. Yeah.
If you start to flip through a lot of Blue Grimoires, and if you know some of the more, I'm going to say, scholarly manuscripts, it's like the Heptameron, they just take that whole seven days of the week thing. It's just right in there. But instead of having the huge onerous prayers and things like that, it's just right into like, here's how you summon a demon right here. There's no, it's really just like, oh, okay. I don't know if that's going to work, but it's there nevertheless. Let's hang on the secret of secrets. Because you talked about it a little bit, but what are these specifically? Because there's a bit more to them.
Yeah, absolutely. What you consider the secret of secrets, right? So essentially, once you had invoked the demon, just to take the Grand Grimoire example, made a pact and summoned them, you were done, right? So then you really wanted to get into the secrets. So there would be a list of fortunate and unfortunate days, when you could do planting or works and stuff. And then very, very specific things like, how do I prepare a divining rod? How do I enchant firearms? How to win lotteries, right? Which is good. How to love whichever girl or woman you might wish. And that's an extremely interesting one, from my complete illustrated Grand Grimoire. Very, very simple. So it says, while picking an alpine leek, which is really the Victoriarium, Allium Victorialis, you just say the following words: I gather you in the name of Shiva, so that you serve me by granting me the love of, dash. And then you basically place this herb on the intended person. You touch that person with the herb. So it's a kind of, magic of that form without her noticing it. And she will immediately love you. Now, it might, smell a bit, but right. That's so simple, right? Literally, pluck an onion and say this thing, and then, touch that person and you're done, right? So it was, as simple as that, right? Now, different editions, and if you look at, in Italy and all across, they actually have a very, very diverse set of secrets, right? And so it goes pretty rich. And Joseph Peterson has actually done some great work in finding different variants of that and bringing them together. But yeah, this was probably the most popular part of the actual grimoire. Even if you didn't do any of the actual invocations and pacts, you could at least do this, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. They're so fascinating. Everybody skips over the secret of secrets stuff. And I always find it's because it is about the kind of grassroots things that would have been pertinent to people living rurally at the time for the most part. Things like making sure that your wheat grows and how do I get the love of a woman? As Aaman said, they're very, very short. They're just like, you do this thing, you do this, and then it'll happen. And they're really quite brilliant. I absolutely love them. While a lot of them seem very impractical.
That one isn't. I mean, you could test it. Yeah. So, absolutely.
Because a lot of times this would be produced by a publishing company, these grimoires would be produced by a publishing company that wouldn't just be producing grimoires. They'd be producing a lot of things involving stories like Juan de Bordeaux, what you mentioned earlier. It's funny when you mentioned that, because I did an episode on Oberon. That's the first time that Oberon comes up, is it not?
One of the first. I mean, technically you can trace him back to Alberic and stuff, but really in popular form, that's Oberon, right? And he gets and that essentially was the basis for Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream 2, right? And then other versions. So it's quite central in that sense.
Yeah. So these publishing companies, a lot of times they wouldn't just be producing grimoires, they'd be producing things that were popular. Whatever was popular, a lot of fanciful stuff. So if you have any examples, I'd love to hear them as well. But how do certain folkloric and story elements get involved in the content of these grimoires?
Oh, yeah. So the Conte de Fées, the fairy tales, were very popular. One of my favorite is the one called, the Blue Bird. Again, many versions of it. But yeah, so if you really think of any of the famous genre or really tales, you'll probably find it in the thing, right? So the Blue Bird is really about this, the son and daughter of a poor woodcutter sent out by the fairy. They have to search for the world for the blue bird of happiness, right? And that's such a beautiful concept. Yeah. Now, of course, in different versions, they go through different adventures. They're lost in the woods. They find their way back. And, so it's one of the very, maybe in the genre of, the Hansel and Gretel area. But this one it's the Princess Bird, right? And an English translation is, by Andrew Lang in the Green Fairy book. So this one, I really like, because there's also, again, it comes into the Green Knight genre and there's musicals about it. So people love these kinds of very simple tales that, took them out of their kind of very humdrum lives. And so they were very popular. And again, astrology manuals were extremely popular, divination, predictions for the next 3 to 5 years, which were either, almanacs or real predictions, right? The king's going to do this or what have you. So there was those were the most popular, I'd say, and cookbooks. Yeah, cookbooks never go out of fashion.
Never. One of the more fascinating things when you come across a lot of these blue grimoires also is that while considered a magician, Paracelsus or Paracelsus, he talks about the 4 elementals, right? And you have nine sylphs, gnomes, and salamanders, which they're all based off of the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air, right? And that gets involved in a kind of folkloric story, which is the Comte de Gabalis, or the Count of Kabbalah. And then you start looking at Bibliothèque Blue Grimoires, and they're taking not from Paracelsus, they're taking from the Comte de Gabalis, and those are involved in a lot of the Blue Grimoires as well. And I'll have a copy in the show notes, I believe. I'll have one of us like, I don't think that anybody who published this even knows about Paracelsus, but it's very obvious that they know about the Comte de Gabalis. I just think it's incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, and see, this is an example of how you really cannot separate the history of science from the history of magic, right? Paracelsus and all of these people were active scientists. A lot of people neglect that the Petit Albert in that name is not Albertus Magnus, but another Albert, who Albert of Saxony, right, who was in about the 14th century. He came up with the concept in a book called Impetus of gravity, right? I mean, gravity existed, but he wrote the concept that if I push something, it goes faster and then it stops it down the hill. That's the basic. So, I mean, yeah, we're doing all of this, but you really can't separate these fields of things. I mean, people didn't separate them back then. So yeah. Yeah.
I love that concept though, because it's very, very true. And not only is it just like science and imagination and magic, but it's also
Mhm.
stories and folklore, like all
Yep.
of these things. Science is
Yeah.
itself a story, right? And when we put it on such a high pedestal, it forgets where it comes from and how it's transmitted, and this strange dance of imagination and magic. It's truly, when it gets too untethered by its foundations, I find that people, when they do talk about science and try to
Right.
talk about
Right.
science and magic in the same breath, about how science can undo all magic and that this is all just horrible stuff. It's like, I would go back and see how all of this plays together and how it moved through populations and how they've influenced both
Yeah.
stories, folklore, and magic has influenced things like science, and vice versa. It's incredibly fascinating. What was the reputation of these books on the populations which came into contact with them?
Much like today, there would have been a division between people who consider them heretical and forbidden, and those who, just use them. Very often, though, just like today, those who consider them heretical and forbidden also had copies and
Right.
reference them or use
Yep.
them,
Yep.
right? So, essentially, it was that tasty candy that you just can't do without, right? Even though it's not very good for you. So but it was very, because it was portable, easy to use. Everyone knew them, right? So, and whether they approved of them or not, it was available, and they could pass them around, right? And so, like you mentioned, it led to a rise in literacy, and there were specific censorship laws. There was an ordinance of Moulin that printers had to submit their works for approval. But there were ways around that. They would submit it and then use their name but change the content before it got into the peddler's hands, right?
That's right.
So there was a lot of that. The church, would the whole Inquisition sought out and prosecuted authors, printers, peddlers. So a lot of that was happening. So it wasn't that these were possibly kept on the shelf, but at least everyone had a Bible, and this would be kind of next to that, right? And there were many versions of, again, another interesting thing is, while the Bible had become almost standardized by then, and definitely by the 18th century it was, this was still a means of getting those additional books that were kind of left out of the Bible into people's hands. Many of the evangelists, lives and apocalypses and all that were part of the grimoire, or rather the Bibliothèque Blue tradition, and so people were getting access to stuff, whether it was officially allowed or not. And so it definitely had an influence, right? Napoleon, I should mention, was very influential because when he came to power, he encouraged and fostered the library system and created the National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale of France. And then as he kind of expanded, his domain, so when he basically took the Serene Republic of Venice and dissolved it, right? And said, your time is over. This is now, the modern era. He brought with him to Venice the same printers, publishers, institutions that pretty much led to an explosion in Italian, publishing. So, and so that just went further and further, right? While these huge revolutions and, social upheavals and inquisition was happening, there was this substrate, and Jake's talked about this, that kept the folk traditions going, right? So really, I mean, people have talked about that unbroken chain. While there are links missing in the unbroken chain, there was a transmission of knowledge from the PGM all the way to kind of modern times, right?
Yeah, yeah. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Here's the thing: if there is one book for my whole Doug's magical book series that people need to get, it's Owen Davies's Grimoires, A History of Magic books. He talks about Bibliothèque Bleue so well in this book, but I love this one sentence where he's talking about somebody in Paris was talking about walking down a high street, and when they would walk past the windows of booksellers or even people selling books on the street, a lot of times all they would see with these Bibliothèque Blue Grimoires. And then this one person that is quoted in this book is just basically says, for those of us that thought that we were progressing as being a logical and rational species, if you visit the high street and look at what kind of books are the most popular, you'll see that unfortunately that's not true, that we are still regressing. People loved these books. Yeah, they were not just the stories and the fairy tales, but what we're talking about today, the ones with all of the spells, the pictures, the Book of Secrets. People loved them. They couldn't get enough of them. And we'll never have the number, because I know people will be like, well, how many of these were sold? We will never be able to have the numbers for this, because a lot of times they were printed like under the table, and they would change the names of things. But most likely close to 1 million, like a lot of these.
Oh yeah, there were at least 2,500, and if you think there were like even 1,000 copies per, that's close over 2.5 million. Books.
Just incredible amounts of them. So, what was the church's position on these books?
Yeah, so the clergy officially condemned them, right? Many of the Bibliothèque Blue or the Blue Grimoires appear in the Vatican's Index Librorum Prohibitum. So it was definitely off the books, and so nobody would be caught dead, or really they were killed dead if they were caught with them. And so there was a close scrutiny from religious leaders. Absolutely. Yeah.
What's really funny though is that a lot of times these would be found in the hands of a lot of clergy within they wanted these books too. It's very fascinating. Did the French government, you mentioned the French government, did they try to crack down on them?
They did. There were at least 2 or 3 kind of cases that were tried. I mean, I'm sure many people were arrested, but 2 or 3 went up to the larger courts. I'm trying to remember there was a couple of very, I don't know, say controversial, apart from the censorship laws and the suppression of seditious content, that's what they cared about, but they brought, there was this colporteur in the early 18th century, Jean Charlier. He was arrested for distributing these, and, he was I don't think he was executed, but he spent jail. Another one, Claude Lejeune, was actually cited as selling books from the church's Index of Forbidden Books, right? So they use those laws actively, right? The Inquisition definitely cited those issues. Possession of these books was considered, and that's another interesting thing. Quite often the grimoire in itself was considered magical or heretical, not just the contents, right? But the physical object was what they were really concerned about, right? And that being said, the theologians did, a lot of the grimoires use, clerical language, clerical objects. And so it's almost, given that the, clergy or parts of the clergy were definitely, using these, writing them, experimenting with them, for sure, that was happening. Yeah.
Let's hang on to that. This idea of the grimoire as a talisman was huge for the Bibliothèque Blue. Yeah. Again, a lot of these people could not read them, but they would have them on them. So how did that work, Aaman? Did that?
Yeah, no, it was considered totally, forbidden. So they would very often use a different cover. So, it was a blue book, right? So everyone had those blue books. So they would use a different cover, but the content would be the actual grimoire, as it were, right? So it might be the blue bird, but it's actually, the red dragon, right? So, yeah. So that was, I guess, one thing. The peddlers had those bags. They actually came up with hidden compartments in them. And, so that's how they passed them around. And they were on constant movement, right? They didn't stay in any one town. So they, it would be hard. You could really get rid of them before the next thing. Then essentially, places were so spread out. You could take any path. The highway system wasn't, what it is. I don't know. The highway system still not what it should be. But yeah, so there was also, it's hard to pin this down, a kind of secret movement, a secret set of codes or names that were used to communicate availability of these books. So it's not that you should just go and pick them off like from the local store, but if you could say, hey, I want that. And, in addition to giving you the latest salacious stuff, slide one more of those things in, right? The grimoires in. Yeah.
Yeah. There's this wonderful thing that I read where at some point the church were telling their priests to check around their church when they would do before they would do masses, because the population would bring their blue grimoires in, stash them under the altar or under the pews and things like that, because a lot of times the grimoire is like, you need to consecrate this book, or you have to be there during a mass. And so the priests would go and actually do like a sweep, like a bomb search these days with a sniffing dog, but they would do a sweep of their church to try and find these blue grimoires that had been stashed there so people could consecrate them. Because again, the books, a lot of times the book would be in some way talismanic. It would be a protective charm for those who didn't know how to read things. They would think that the book was itself, the object of the book itself was in some way magical. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what actually something very interesting is when this moved to the US, the colporteurs actually were very, very well known for the peddlers for transmitting religious texts, right? So there's this very famous publishing house called the American Tract Society. It was founded in New York City in 1825. They literally used the term colporteur. So, I mean, whether they knew what it meant, but they just used that for distributing their text. While peddlers this was literally their channel. So denominational texts being distributed by these guys who in France would have been doing that. And we shouldn't forget, like, since we're talking about that genre, Benjamin Franklin himself took the concept of he was, of course, heavily exposed to what happening in France, but his Poor Richard's Almanac was, bow to the principle. And then the Long Lost Friend, which is an extremely popular, American grimoire, as it were, is again in the same, line of the Blue Grimoires, although it's kind of a little bigger than that. Yeah.
Yeah. I could definitely do a full episode about it, but the Dutch and German immigrants that came to the United States, their grimoire was the 6th and 7th book of Moses, which in my opinion is the most influential grimoire of all time. Like Petit Albert,
it's fabulous.
Which is a grimoire but this thing spread like wildfire, and because of its reputation and the fact that a lot of people also considered it like a talismanic book and all of the things in it, it was magic and people's insistence and desire to be a part of this kind of stuff is just such a fascinating
the number one book again in the colonies that next to the Bible was John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, right? And that was while it wasn't part of the official Blue Bibliothèque Blue, was again distributed in very, very similar sizes and packaging. And so you see the huge popularity, Daniel Defoe, and his books. So these are people who actually knew that potential, and that adaptation would happen, right? In France, like every region had its own kind of adaptations in the colonies, as well as it moved between, the colporteurs were also, like, because they were distribution agents, were getting feedback, right? So they weren't going to carry books that were not selling, right? So they would provide feedback to publishers, and essentially that was very, very instantaneous, because if something didn't sell, they were going to dump it back, and so that also kind of tells you if it persists today or survives today, they were popular, right? Whatever they were selling was popular. Yeah.
Very cool. I forgot that aspect of it for sure. Yeah. If this stuff is driven by the market, truly market in popularity plays a huge part in how these grimoires are, and even the fact that sometimes we have copies of them today. But as Aaman has mentioned, that a lot of them are very cheap paper, and a lot of them are falling apart. But there will be some scans of some of them.
Yeah.
Let's have some fun here. What we're going to do is we're going to, because I know everybody's been waiting for this moment. Let's talk about some specific grimoires.
Sure.
Let's start with the Mac Daddy. In my opinion, this is the one that if you want to know about Blue Grimoires, there's two ones that I would definitely direct people's attention to. The very first one is one that Aaman has translated, which is the Grand Grimoire. So let's talk about this. What can you tell the listeners about this amazing and for its time, and actually not first, maybe first time, but as well afterwards, people called this a diabolical grimoire. They said this was an evil book. But let's let the folks know, what is the Grand Grimoire?
Sure. So, the Grand Grimoire, or it's also called the Red Dragon, right? Was extremely popular. Now, the word grand, it's more marketing. It just means great or large, right? And it was again, it's as Dr. Skinner and others have shown, it was very much part of the Key of Solomon family, right? So it's not terribly for the more, say, formal or well-educated or the grimoire students, it's just one of the unifying things. But as I did find, because I went back to the original manuscripts and kind of brought it together, right? It is a central piece because it consolidates magical traditions which are very diverse, right? From the Kabbalah to Solomonic, as we call it. It may have a trace back to Italian things because it's often signed by Antonio del Rabbia, the Venetian rabbi, and so again, a lot of that was just people claiming this thing, but there's also a Dr. Carter who signed certain editions of the grimoire. So there's could be multiple people, right? It does blend. Here's what's interesting: the Faustian tradition, right? The Mephistopheles and stuff with the Grand Grimoire. So when you, essentially at its core, right, the Grand Grimoire is about making a pact to receive treasure, right? I know of at least one person who has my book who mentioned that he received treasure, not in the classical sense, but like winning a lottery around 4 times by following, the rituals here. But to connect it back to the Faustian traditions, when you sign the treasure, there is, according to the Grand Grimoire, a large dog guarding the treasure, which is essentially what Mephistopheles kind of sees, right? And interestingly, Mephistopheles itself can be translated in one way to Lucifuge. Mephistopheles, flee from the light. Lucifuge is flee from the light. Lucifuges. Right. And so there are interesting things, right? From a structural standpoint, while it has a bad reputation about selling your soul to the devil and stuff, as I demonstrate, you don't have to do that. The whole book warns against giving up your soul, but really making a contract. It clearly says a contract for charity, right? So Lucy says, I'm going to give you this treasure, but in return, you will have to be charitable, as you go through the whole thing, right? The core of the grimoire is a central prayer, the Holy Kingdom or the Sanctum Regnum. So it's a hierarchy of spirits. It has about 27 or only 18 subordinate spirits, and those are all found in the Lesser Key of Solomon, other than Pruslas, and may have been lost in the Lesser Key. And so that definitely puts it in the whole ecosystem of the Key of Solomon, right? So I think it's extremely useful. It works fairly well. So it was very popular. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah. So this is when everybody thinks about Book of Magic and like the book where you get it and then you do a deal with the devil or some kind of like a demon. The Grand Grimoire is that book, like before anything. And the character that you brought up, what it's named, Lucifuge Rofocale or Rofocale, I've heard it pronounced. There's lots of different pronunciations. Is not the devil. Am I right?
No,
he's not the devil. He's not the minister.
Devil. Right. He's a minister. He's kind of under under Lucifer and so on. So he's the prime minister, I should be more precise, of hell, right? Now he's depicted in almost every one of the texts as a French fool, right? With the three, it's a very fool, and he's pouring wealth on the ground. So like, don't get too addicted to wealth, right? Right. So, and interestingly, not one reviewer, and the book has received 550 reviews, not one reviewer has pointed out that the cover is really a tribute to Aleister Crowley's, Key of Solomon in terms of the cover, right? With the spirits around it.
That's right.
Yeah, so that's a
Nice.
very kind of
Easter egg
intentional.
for everybody there.
Yeah.
There you go.
But yeah, the spirits are essentially Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Astaroth. The LBA are the guys on top, right? Under them, you have Lucifuge as the prime minister, and then Satanakia, Aglere, Pluriti, Sargatanas, and so on. Interestingly, the extreme popularity of this can be illustrated by, in my introduction, I have this, that I found a newspaper article from 1922, right, that essentially compared a particular senator who voted in favor of giving up land to the Germans and called him a Satanakia. Okay, a French newspaper referred to a senator as Satanakia, which kind of tells us that they expected the readers would get the reference, right?
Right.
So I would say it's still extremely popular. The whole hazel wand and so on have been are extremely relevant even today. Yeah, and then we have the popular spells. I shouldn't miss those. Yeah.
Right. When did the first edition of the or what will you consider, like, when did it come about?
There's some ambiguity about that, right? It's between 750 and 1815. I mean, so it's we're not going to be able to pin that down much further. But yeah, I would put it in that range. It of course draws from, again, going back to the Key of Solomon, about a few hundred years, 100 or 150 years earlier. And then even earlier, you can find bit chunks of it in 14th century, 15th century texts. But really, this thing called the Grand Grimoire is about between 750 and 1815. Yeah.
For sure. So something that people are going to come across when they look into Bibliothèque Bleue or Blue Grimoires is that there's going to be this text that comes up called the Red Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
Is it exactly the same thing as the
it's the same. I think for whatever reason, right, there was a variation of text, as we were talking about. And so the really post the Inquisition, people were just coming up with concepts of things. There's even a Grand Grimoire of Saint Cyprian. We were talking about this recently with Jose Laitao, right? In especially in the Spanish-speaking world, you'll find versions of the Grand Grimoire and the Black Hen and so on, right? This thing, but it's kind of really hard to separate out the Grand Grimoire and the Red Dragon, right? 1821 is where I see that convergence happening. The people claim to be 1411 and all that, but it's really 1815, 1821. So not terribly early, but also not post, so to speak, the revolution, right?
Yeah.
So the French edition is the one that is kind of the most earlier version. The German, Italian, and Spanish kind of all draw from it and kind of bring their local this thing, right? So I would say the Grand Grimoire came first, then got rebranded or combined with few things to become the Red Dragon, and then we have a separate thing called the Black Dragon, which is technically a different grimoire.
Yeah, it's a much different grimoire. Well, it's a different grimoire for sure. Yeah. What's so frustrating sometimes when you try and find copies of scans of Blue Grimoires, and I'll have a link to this in the show notes, everybody, is that this Grand Grimoire was so popular that publishers would basically put this grimoire in and then give it the title of other grimoires. So what I have in the show notes is a copy of a book that has the title and illustrations from a grimoire I'm just about to talk about here called the Grimoire of Pope Honorius. But you open it up and it's the Grand Grimoire. Like it's got some of the illustrations, but you're literally just looking at the Grand Grimoire. So hugely popular text. Why was it so popular?
Again, I think it's the name. No, it's the name, right? The Grand Grimoire, right? My edition does well, possibly because I called it the complete illustrated Grand Grimoire, right? When you people go with names, right?
Right.
It sells, right? When you call something the Petit Albert, maybe there's a bigger one, Grand Albert, right? Maybe I should go for that, and then you're dividing your thing. So I think it's that, but more realistically, I do also think that Lucifuge and it's a fairly straightforward, linear set of prayers, right? You basically ask the spirit, like, I need this, and the spirit says, I can't agree, and you say, no, I mean, you got to do it. You don't even need to do the burning rod and stuff. You can just really do the prayers and the pact, and it works, I guess. And so I would say that that's just like the Grimoire Verum, which technically most likely was not a Blue Grimoire. If something works, people tend to stick with it, right? And then the word of mouth and stuff tends to push that branding. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, everybody definitely. If Bibliothèque Blue is interesting and Grimoires are interesting to you, you have to grab a copy of Aaman's the complete Grand Grimoire. He did a really good job.
Yes.
It also includes a translation of a small, short little novel that's in there.
Yes.
As well. Yeah.
Yes, it does. It does.
Fascinating.
Actually, the novel it was written contemporaneously, so you can already see literary criticism of the grimoires, right? It has the same name, but it features a young lad, trying to get somewhat getting carried away with this so-called sorcerer who's really doing, smoke and mirrors to get attention. Right. And he's got a mentor who's the local pharmacist who kind of tells him, hey, this isn't, quite the way things should go. And he gives him scientific food. But what's very interesting is the novel contains long sections of the Grand Grimoire. It contains big disquisitions on spiritualism, right? So it's worth reading just to get that perspective. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. You did such a good job with it. And
thank you.
It was one of those things where when I finally got a hold of it, this is good stuff. Like this is, I forgot why this is a good grimoire. It's a very interesting one, and it's fully illustrated, everybody, as mentioned. So all the seals are in there, and it's really quite wonderful. I would like to talk about a grimoire. This one is a very fascinating one. Now, a lot of times what you will come across is that a lot of the Bibliothèque Blue grimoires are going to be called black magic grimoires. They're referred to as black magic grimoires. If you head to Joseph H. Peterson's website, which is Twilight Grotto or Esoteric Archives, some of these will be listed under the black magic section. So I would like to talk about a specific grimoire called the Grimoire of Pope Honorius. And this is arguably the first black magic grimoire. And it was originally composed in 1670, but it was put into a Bibliothèque Bleue as early as 1760. Now, Eliphas Levi wrote a lot about this grimoire. He said it was a horrible, wicked, and profane book. The 19th century member of the Golden Dawn for a little bit and author on magic, translator of Eliphas Levi's work, A.E. Waite, he hated this grimoire as well. He said, "It is a malicious and somewhat clever imposture, which has undeniably calculated to deceive ignorant persons of its period, who may have been magically inclined, more especially ignorant priests, since it pretends to convey the expressed sanction of the apostolical seat for the operations of infernal magic and necromancy." So the name Pope Honorius is probably there on this grimoire because of the notoriety of another grimoire which came way before it, which is Liber Juratus, or the Sworn Book of Honorius. There you go. If you go through trying to find copies of this grimoire online, what you will find a lot of times is just what I mentioned, that it'll say it's the Grimoire Pope Honorius, but it'll actually just be the Grand Grimoire. David Rankin, guest who I had on for the Fairies and Ritual Magic episode, he has a book out that's got about 3 translations of the Grimoire of Pope Honorius on there. What we see when we look at this grimoire, or especially what David did, is that there's a kind of grimoire there that has been preserved. And what you see is just the same variety of stuff with a lot of these Bibliothèque Blue grimoires. Spirit conjurations, there's treasure. It's got a book of secrets in there as well. It also references another grimoire that I'm going to talk about shortly here called the Enchiridion of Pope Leo III. The Grimoire of Pope Honorius is it's a bit of a mash, if not a riff of other grimoires. It does that thing where it takes the days of the week and applies a certain spirit to it, very much like the Heptameron. It's got elements of another grimoire we're going to talk about in a bit here, the Petit Albert. But what makes this a very popular grimoire is that while the Petit Albert, which is a grimoire that Aaman is going to be talking about shortly here, while it talks about treasure quite a bit in the Petit Albert, there's no real way to get the treasure. It doesn't really tell you how to get that treasure. But in the Grimoire Pope Honorius, whoever put it together is like, don't worry about it. I got your back. So it actually tells you how to get treasure within the Grimoire of Pope Honorius. It's somewhat unique as I said, because it was meant to be done specifically for a priest or somebody working within the church. At least one of the copies of the Grimoire pour Honorius. While it's a mess, it is a heck of a kind of grimoire. I think it's really fascinating. It ticks a lot of boxes. There's a folk magic in there. There's demons. There's treasure. To quote Marge Simpson, I think it's just neat. It's a very, very cool example of a Bibliothèque Blue Grimoire. And as I said, David Rankin is a huge fan. Grab his translation. There's 3 different books in there. It's pretty comprehensive. It's pretty special. Yeah, I'm actually want to talk really quickly here about another grimoire, something that I mentioned in my How to Read Grimoires episode. It's called La Véritable Magie Noire, or True Black Magic. It's from 1790. It is basically a pocket Key of Solomon. This grimoire is probably the first place where we see a craft knife in the grimoire called an arctave, which is probably what got translated to the athame within Wicca. So it's a Key of Solomon. It's a kind of clavicula, again, with some very Catholic elements in there. There's 2 books that are involved in La Véritable Magie Noire. The very first one is kind of preparations. And then the second book is basically just pentacles straight from the Key of Solomon. Arthur Edward Waite, that guy again, he listed it as a black magic grimoire. Compared to the other grimoires that Waite considered to be black magic, this one is very mild. It's got some stuff in there about love, but not really very much about, killing cats and stuffing beans in their head and summoning demons, that kind of stuff. Although summoning spirits is a huge part of, again, because it is a clavicula, it's a pretty mild diabolical black magic grimoire, and quite a few actual parts of True Black Magic or La Véritable Magie Noire made it into Spanish Cyprianic texts as well. What do you got to say about True Black Magic?
Oh, well, it's one of those foundational texts. I don't recall if he's put it in one of his books, right?
He's got it. Yeah.
Okay, I need to check. I have all his books, but I need to go kind of dig that out. I will say that, from my personal thing is shifting a bit away from that to the Grimoire Verum, which it relates to. And, my recent book, The Magical Art, is kind of before that. So it's an area which is a different stream of the Grimoire tradition. Probably the more the true black magic stream, as opposed to the Grand Grimoire, which is more folk magic, right? So you've kind of got that separation. They're really drawing from the same base, as it were, and you'll see. I don't think you people were actively doing a lot. I mean, you do see the Grand Grimoire popularity, but not the the True Black Magic or the Grimoire Verum, not that level of popularity. Yeah.
No. It's kind of one that flies under the radar to this day. But I love Blue Grimoires. I think they're fantastic. True Black Magic is a really cool small. I love that it's a pocket Key of Solomon. The Key of Solomon, the text of the Key of Solomon, to particularly which strand you go down. We could talk about Colorno family or families and stuff like that. True Black Magic, just like a nice little simplified, lots of pentacles. You make those pentacles, you do the thing that's on them. It's really solid.
Oh yeah, the pentacles were the big thing, because again, like we were speaking earlier, even if you can do the entire rituals and you need a lot of knowledge and stuff, you could still make a pentacle and there you go, right? So the Petit Albert, again, big time into talismanic, art and talismans, right? And so, yeah.
Let's talk about that grimoire that you just... So while we did talk about the Grand Grimoire, you need to know this as a Bibliothèque Blue Grimoire. I would, and perhaps Aaman would agree with me, that there is no grimoire within the Bibliothèque Blue that is as influential as the Petit Albert. So let's take the listeners through it. Go ahead. What is Le Petit Albert?
Okay, so the Petit Albert, again, Little Albert. And again, as we said, it's not Albertus Magnus. It's also not the Albert of the Albert. So really, it's an anonymous grimoire, like many of these, right? Giving a name. And essentially, the content here was a variety of practices, right? It was talismanic sorcery. It was, folk rituals. It was the very controversial or maybe popular Hand of Glory, right? And the Hand of Glory, essentially, for the listeners, was a kind of candle made from the left hand of an executed man, ideally executed murderer. I don't know if they were too, particular, right? Any hand will do, any thing. But it was considered more diabolical, right? It was definitely, it had a huge cultural impact, right? Because especially in rural flats, the common folk seeking practical solutions would literally make those talismans, right, and kind of swear by them or hold them close. I think you mentioned earlier, it didn't just spring out of nowhere. It was heavily drawing from Paracelsus and Agrippa's, and so that stream, right. The author was definitely, as you can expect, well read, right, and was bringing it together in a very compact way. The spells themselves are the usual: protection, love, health, success. No surprises there. What the popular fields. The materials, if I recall, metal, stones, herbs. Again, you will see a convergence of, certain types of, objects and metals, and people were familiar with them, right? These were the kind of classical 7 metals and stuff. It also does demonstrate that clear, straight line from the past. I think like you're saying, it was extremely influential beyond just the text. I mean, while the text is very well known, that those little, the Blue Grimoires, the cultural impact or the practical distribution was immense, right? So it's almost, you can consider it an Albert family, although I don't know if, we should use that, but yeah, like the Colonna family, it became a basis, right? A. White, Levi's references to it. But I think even today, there are numerous, almost so many translations of it. It's hard to say which is the definitive one.
Yeah. There's so many, and here's the funny thing about it is that you'll find a lot of them online, and a lot of them really concentrate on the whole hand of glory thing. Right. Again, it was a hand that you take from a criminal, you kind of pickle it, you take the blood out of it, you preserve it, and then you attach a candle to it, and it will stupefy people that would try and interact with you while you were robbing their house or a bank. It's just such a strange object. And correct me if I'm wrong, Aaman, but the hand of glory, the translation is Mangalo, which is basically mandrake. Is it not?
Well, that's a great point. There is indeed a close correlation between the mandrake and the hand of glory. The mandrake does look like a hand. More likely than not, that's where it began. Man gloire, right? Man is hand, gloire is glory. So that's literally, it's a literal translation. So very likely, while there were possibly people who were cutting hands off, almost nobody, would just do that. So very likely these were indeed the mandrakes, right? And the mandrake is one of the first plants that Albert Linnaeus classifies, right? So it goes mandragora basically, right? There's mandragora I think officiarum and autumnalis. So there's 2 kinds. Beautiful plant, very hard to grow, right? And it was. For whatever reason, it was very popular in medicine, and then it kind of went down, I guess, mainly because it was scary or whatever. The Germans also have an interesting usage for it. They call it Al-Rune or All-Rune, and rune, of course, is the word. So essentially, they imply that it was extremely versatile, right? And so that's definitely, it is toxic. I mean, it is supposed to grow near gallows is what I've heard. I mean, possibly that's where this thing comes together. It does have, not recommended to ingest. It's hallucinogenic, narcotic, so don't go there. But yeah, the Petit Albert, see, here's the 2 things about the, number one, it didn't have, like in the Grand Grimoire, you'll probably find 10, 20 secrets. The Petit Albert had probably 100.
Yeah, there's so many. It's not really a grimoire. It's a book of secrets.
It's a book of secrets.
That's all
exactly.
It is.
And another connotation of which is often lost, it was quite intentionally for the common people. Petit Albert really was the little people, the country people. And so they saw it as their text. So you can almost see divergence between the Grand Grimoire and the Petit Albert, right? These two kind of being almost two poles, and people, just using what they could, right? It doesn't come with a lot of these pacts and long invocations and stuff, right? It's very practical.
I'm going to push back on that though, because there's a bit of a thing though, where it's a lot of times it'll also talk about like fortifying and making your own wine and making vinegar and things that wouldn't necessarily have been easy for a lot of people who would have lived rurally. So I suspect that what was happening with the people that put the Petit Albert together was that they were just trying to cast a wide net. They just wanted everybody to read it, because we'd also find that there were copies of Petit Albert in noble people's libraries. It was a book for almost everybody, because there was just so many charms. There's, as you said, there's well over 100 there, and it's fascinating. And what's interesting is that when there was kind of like a meme back in the day where if you said that somebody had the Petit Albert, when people would talk and gossip about somebody, they'd go, "Oh, that person's got the Petit Albert," that would be a euphemism for saying that that person's dabbling in magic. It would just be another way of saying that person's doing magic.
Right. I see, Voltaire referencing it. I mean, it was so popular. You won't find almost anybody just unaware of it. Right. So it was, of course, the gauche, right? The left hand path, not the right hand, which again, people didn't really have much, I would say, distinction. If you were doing stuff, you were doing it outside the pale, as it were. Yeah. Yeah,
I have a fun little story here about Petit Albert, which is Canada. For people that don't know, Canada has two official languages. It's English and it's French. There was a French colony in Canada hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It's now a province. We call it Quebec. And so there were a lot of people from France that would be in Quebec. And so what happens, and this is something that we're going to talk about in a few minutes here, is that these grimoires, because they're so easy to carry with you, they traveled. And so the Petit Albert has a history within Quebec. In fact, there was a gentleman, I forget his name. He was an author that talked about and lamented the fact that people were using the Petit Albert to hunt for treasure in Quebec. But what he did is that this guy released a book talking about how stupid it was that people were using these blue grimoires to look for treasure in Quebec, in Canada, where there wasn't any kind of like buried treasure like there would be in Europe. He put this book out with the name The Petit Albert in the title of his book, and it sold gangbusters. This guy who was trying to shit talk blue grimoires, it sold a ton. And the reason it sold is because the name Petit Albert was in the title, and people thought that they were buying the Petit Albert when they would buy this book. Yeah, and so it's just like it was trying to say that blue grimoires are not cool. There's no reason to do treasure hunting. These people are dumb. The people that are using these concepts, I just thought that was a fascinating.
That's almost the norm. You will find whether it's the famous when a king writes a thing saying this is the forbidden text and includes the entire text of the forbidden text, people are going to use it for the purposes of magic, possibly, right? Yeah. So, I mean,
The Petit Albert is a enormously influential grimoire. Like we could probably do a full episode about the Petit Albert. Fascinating, huge in New Orleans, huge in places like Barbados.
Marie Laveau was very cheap. She had that as one of her sources, I would say, for her books. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would love to talk about it a bit more. Maybe somewhere down the line we'll get Aaman back on. We'll talk about
I do know, and I don't think it's been published yet. It is one of the notable authors on Haitian is really coming up with a book that's going to be both the Petit and the Grand Albert together. And
awesome.
And so, I don't know if it's announced. So I'm going to wait for the announcement. Yeah.
For sure. Something that people need to realize, though, is that the Petit Albert is not a condensed version of the Grand Albert. It's completely different. It's not a bridge. There is nothing in the Petit Albert that is in the Grand Albert.
Exactly. Yeah.
Completely different. Right. Yeah. I want to talk about two more grimoires here before we continue with the questions. The other grimoire I'd love to talk about is the Enchiridion of Pope Leo III. It's a somewhat early book that was later put into a Bibliothèque Blue. So it started around 1633, and then it was Bibliothèque bleue in 1740. It's mentioned the police records for a lot of the people that were interviewed during the affair of the poisons.
Yep.
So we knew it was around, and then because of the affair of the poisons in France, in this plot that maybe the king might have been poisoned, people knew about this grimoire, the Enchiridion of Pope Leo III. It's a very strange grimoire. It's one of those ones that people don't talk about very much these days.
Oh yeah.
Very Christian, a lot of psalms, numerous orisons for many things. It was probably inspired by the release of, it's called Collectiana Pseudo Bede, and also by Mary. So Mary Magdalene inspired Liturgy of Hours. The Collectiana Pseudo Bede is an interesting one. There's that expression, I don't know if people are familiar with it. Rome falls when the Colosseum falls. Mm-hmm. And when the Colosseum falls, the world falls. That comes from this collection. Anyways, Charlemagne is
consecrated. Yeah, Charlemagne praised the book. You're right.
That's right. That's right.
That's amazing.
He's right. That's right there. So the title Pope Leo III. Leo was he was the Pope during Charlemagne's rule. Right at the very beginning, it name drops Agrippa. So of course you know that it's going to be a good book. There's pentacles, there's spirits, there's an orison to Saint Cyprian in there, right? Yep. Very weird spell in there that wants you to make a talisman in the shape of the wound on the side of Christ when he was on the cross and stabbed by a spear. It can be used for a bunch of things, protection, and I forget some of the other ones, but it's very weird. Here's the thing. Most grimoires, I've heard of at least one person trying and going through it. I have literally never heard of anybody going through the Enchiridion of Pope Leo III. But I will say this, everybody, if you're a Christian and you want something fun to work through, like a grimoire, and you feel like you're not stepping on the toes of any of the your I'm going to say
ancestors.
That's right. Yeah. The Enchiridion of Pope Leo III, I think, is a very fascinating one. It's very interesting. It has things that you're supposed to do as you go about your day. Very weird, very fascinating. I would love to hear somebody going through.
Yeah, that. Something interesting about the Enchiridion, which makes it very topical to our discussion of these, Bibliothèque Blue, these little portable books. The word Enchiridion literally comes from handbook. Enchir, in the hand. Idion is typically small. So little book held in the hand. So it's quite literally the proto handbook of magic, or the Blue Grimoires, as it were.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for throwing that out there. Great.
Yeah. The Enchiridion and of course the Grand Grimoire made their way into the French colonies, the Caribbean. While we were talking about New Orleans, they were hugely popular. They fused with the African traditions there. And so you will see versions of that in the L.W. de Lawrence, those big books he made. So I don't want to lose sight of that, although that's a whole different conversation. I hope you're going to cover that at some point in a future episode.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to talk about it a bit just after I talk about this last grimoire, but we'll talk about the New World, because these, as I said, these books travel. They're portable and they go. And I just as a bit of a tease before we actually get to that question, the Caribbean magical tradition with ATRs, or African traditional religions that came from these places, the magical aspects of these things come straight from Biblical Blue. Like it's one-to-one relation. They're right there. The last grimoire I would love to talk about is called the Black Pullet. Now, this is a very interesting grimoire in the sense that it's a grimoire that is couched within a story. It is not practical. And I'm just going to say, as far as like grimoires are concerned, this one is more of just that kind of thing where it was something fun to read. And it was just something that you'd most likely, the people that would read this would be like, oh, it's a story. It's magical. I hope it could be true in some sense. It comes from it's late. So it comes mainly as far back as 1820. The story is thus. It's a French officer in Egypt with Napoleon. He is attacked by a group of Bedouins there, and he is the only survivor. He crawls, while injured, to the pyramids, of course, because there's just pyramids everywhere in Egypt. And he sees a Turkish man come out of one of the pyramids. He gets his attention. This person grabs this wounded soldier, this wounded officer, and he brings him inside one of the pyramids to one of the secret chambers in there. And it turns out that this person is a great wizard, and he has all of the magical secrets that were from, in quotes, from the grimoire. They were all the secrets from the library that was burned at Alexandria. This wounded officer and this Turkish man, they form a bond, teaches him magic. There's a small initiation that happens there. And it's a very weird grimoire. Apparently, the secret of magic, everybody, the secret of magic, according to the Black Pullet, is love. So isn't that great? Love for God, love for yourself, that kind of things. Rings and talismans, that forms a big part of this. You get a ring, you get a talisman, you hold the talisman to your heart, you say these certain words, and it gives you magic. The images are pretty cool. I love the images in the Black Pullet, particularly the figure number 4 that's got a skull and crossbones on it and a scythe. Very, very cool. They look a lot like pentacles from the Key of Solomon, except a lot of them are either diamonds or square, although there's quite a few round ones. The final part of the book is where the title comes from, which is the Black Pullet, or the hen that lays golden eggs. So remember when we were talking about folklore having a part in grimoires? Everybody knew by this point about a chicken that would lay golden eggs. Well, guess what? The Black Pullet is that. So what happens is that this last part of the book, it talks about how the wizard, he burns wood and he burns leaves. And he takes this golden egg and he places it on the smoke, and then the egg vanishes. And then in the smoke and from where this egg was, a chicken appears. Yes, a black hen appears. And it doesn't lay golden eggs. But what it does do is it seeks out gold. So it finds gold.
Treasure. Yep.
That's right. It finds treasure like a pig finds truffles. This rooster will find treasures. This wizard at the end of the book, he tells the narrator he'll die as he's nearly 300 years old. This Turkish magician, he dies. The narrator goes back to France with his familiar spirit. I forget the name of this spirit within the book, but it follows him to France, and he takes this chicken. And the last few paragraphs are just talking about how awesome his gold-seeking hen is. And then because he has this hen that can find gold, he lives very privately and quietly because he has such a crazy story. It's just one of those things where Egyptomania was at an all-time high around when it was made because of Napoleon. It's worth a read. There's online versions. They're not right. A lot of the online versions are really garbled, but I know that Black Letter Press has a version of the Black Pullet, I believe you can find. Yeah, not a very practical grimoire. I think it's a really fun story.
Oh, yeah. And it was, of course, I think I mentioned, very often bundled with the Grand Grimoire, again, because of the treasure spirits, concept. The origin story about this French officer quite obviously is the Napoleonic campaign, and Napoleon, who supposedly spent a night in the pyramids. Most likely he did not. He just walked in, looked around, and kind of left. He didn't bomb them or anything like the movie shows. But I just want to mention one thing about the Black Pullet or the black hen, right? And the golden eggs. That's essentially alchemy, right? The Nigredo stage to the golden eggs are really the Enlightenment. So that's the heart of that, is essentially the alchemical journey or the hermetic journey, right? From darkness to light. Yeah.
Yeah. So, very fascinating, very fascinating grimoire. And thanks for pointing that out too, because what's also happening with people's interest in magic is this interest in alchemy and Rosicrucians. And so these books were produced to be popular, right? So we see that's and just throwing a couple of weird spells in there. Again, the spells and the rituals within the Black Pullet are you make a ring, you have a seal, you put the seal on your heart and you hold it, you breathe a little bit and say the words, and then next thing you know, one of them is that beautiful women, they'll be so attracted to you. Every beautiful woman will be attracted to you. Okay. I mean, I've said quite a lot of things and nothing.
Oh, no, this is interesting. I mean, it's definitely, I mean, it's kind of out there, but it also shows us that, cultural osmosis, right? You see Egypt, you see France, you see that's amazing, because you're seeing another layer of cultural transmission and syncretism happening, through these texts, right? Yeah.
Let's talk about the fact that these things travel. So what happened to the Bibliothèque Blue when they made it to the New World?
Oh, so they were the New World, again, fairly into popular literature. We talked about Benjamin Franklin. He was definitely one of them. There was Isaac. I can't. I'm thinking Isaac Bonowitz, but the Quakers were definitely into that. Cotton Mather, of Salem fame, they were publishing various tracts or pamphlets. We talked to the American Tract Society, who were creating these, right? They totally embraced these. Most of these texts traveled overseas, and you'll find them in libraries or people's collections. They were adapted. So there was local versions. The Long Lost Friend is just one version, although coming more from the German side, in the 6-7 Book of Moses. They were seen as practical guides, right? So there were versions that had maps and directions and tips on how to engage with the local people, and so there was the Protestant ministers adapted their interpretations and again produced those. So it became very much the basis for modern American literature, as it were, right? So there was a whole local medicinal plants. There was I think I've seen a North Carolina version and an Appalachian Trail version and so on, right? So yeah, I don't know if it went too far west, but definitely in the original 13 colonies. Yeah.
And as I said, the Caribbean was so influential, at least the French-speaking parts of the Caribbean. Bibliothèque Blue Grimoires are where a lot of their magical traditions come from. And you can see it so much. And particularly, I don't want to steal his thunder, but if you read Owen Davies' book, Grimoires, A History of Magical Books, he talks about just how important these French cheap paperbacks were to the New World and other magical traditions there. There's a wonderful story. Well, it's not wonderful. It's a gruesome story about an individual. I hope I'm getting the name right. His name is Rupert Mapp. He was a laborer who was going to a farm in Barbados, I believe just outside of Bridgetown there. And he was eventually murdered. And what transpired is that the murderers were the people that brought him to this house, that lured him to this house. They very obviously had a copy of the Petit Albert, because Rupert Mapp was murdered, his head was cut off, and his hands were cut off, and they found the hands drained of blood. So they were trying to use this poor person's body or their hands as a hand of glory. They later found the court had no idea that that's what the ambition was. It wasn't until somebody looked at this later and said, oh, they're very clearly doing this to get hands of glory in Barbados. These books definitely had a heft on the traditions, a lot of times to do with the slave populations that existed there as well, mixing with the African traditional religions. It's so fascinating just how these grimoires made an impact and where they made an impact. And I know last episode I talked about the Book of Saint Cyprian. Same thing there. Like the Grand Grimoire is their version of the Book of Saint Cyprian, or the Jonas Solferino Book of Saint Cyprian. That's just basically the Grand Grimoire, and that still has a tenure to this day. People are still using Books of Cyprian to this day. So it's incredibly fascinating. Again, a whole episode could be done about the transmission of and the German books as well. It's magic travels and it adapts and it moves through. Same thing going on with basically Mormonism. Hello, you've got the Cole Portiers. Joseph Smith doesn't do the treasure hunting if he doesn't have access to these cheap paperbacks, right?
Yep. The 6 and 7 Book of Moses, essentially. Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you this, Aaman, because you were friends with Jake Stratton Kent. You talked to him quite a bit. I have to say, because he produced a series of books called the Encyclopedia Goetica. It's got several theses. But one of the theses of this book, or this series of books, and there's 5 of them, but they're split into 3, so it's a trilogy, is that Blue Grimoires contain survivals of magical techniques akin to those of Greek sorcerers, or as we know them, the Goetes, or what we would call Goetic sorcerers, where we get there's the grimoire, the Ars Goetia. That word itself comes from Goes, which were kind of considered what we would call huckster magicians that would try to conjure up the spirits of the dead or angry spirits, the Goas. That Blue Grimoires, they have survivals from ancient Greek, which were disseminated and freed from more scholarly and, dare I say, upper class grimoire magicians of the 17th and 18th century. Do you suspect that the people that were producing these books somehow kept that continuum all the way from ancient Greece into these grimoires, whereas
Yeah,
like John Dee's stuff was not that, and say things like claviculas, they didn't have that.
right.
What
Yeah.
do you think? What do you think?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So see, Jake embodies the principles of the kind of really the self-taught, magician, as it were, right? The self-taught. He delved deep and he span a whole, entire universe of knowledge. He is forever in the realm of interpretation now, but he demonstrated really, in fact, the concept of historical continuity, right? He took these texts, from very fragmented sources and kind of restored them, demonstrating really that historical continuity, right? So essentially, he proved that they have ancient roots, not just with the PGM and stuff, but also in the Balkans and the smith workers of the mountainous regions in Europe, right? And the transmission of knowledge. So you will find resonances, right? Both in terms of ritual techniques, circles, and talismanic methods. So you see similar talismans in those. Right now, the advantage we have, even though the blue grimoires many are lost, I'm sure. Based on what we have, we can see that this was a cascading down of those knowledge traditions to the popular realm, right? In a way, what Jake was talking about. So, the content is, as we were talking about, entirely practical magic, not kind of theoretical magic, right? It is built on folk traditions, and so that's again, really what they were intended to convey, and the accessibility and dissemination was the whole key, right? The mass production, the portability, and the ease of referencing. And really, if you look at it during the time when, so to speak, the larger world was moving towards almost a stratification and an ossification of knowledge layers. So you have the scientists and you have the philosophers. You've got this down the same forces, right, of mass production and knowledge transmission, helping to convey the subterranean current that Jake really talks about through these blue grimoires. So in that sense, they're very important. Jake's own books, the Enchiridion Goetica, the volume 1 is of course a true grimoire, but volume 2 and 3 show that how these knowledge streams came together and really, in a way led to what we now call the magical revival. But in reality, it's not really a magical revival. There was a stream. It's just that we exist in a time where it's very easy to kind of tap into that, and we are fortunate that, Jake and Joseph Peterson and Dr. Skinner and so on are doing this effort of bringing those in reliable sources, right? And we are able to access them. But now we can do comparative studies, right, between this version, this text, and that's where I guess the most interesting work is. There's of course, as you can almost expect, hundreds of texts that have either not been translated or not even been discovered or been possibly miscatalogued, right? And just sitting in someone's shelf, they don't know what they are.
The Pope has them. He's got all of them.
Yeah, so we're going to do Ocean's 15, Vatican edition.
Right.
So
absolutely.
Yeah, we're planning that. But the Greek magical papyri and the Blue Grimoire do share several common magical techniques, right? The invocation of spirits, the summoning of demons, the invocation models are similar. I mean, of course, I think the barbarous names kind of just went away.
Yeah, they went away.
Right. Yeah. But that, that aside, the concept of the symbol and the dream workings, you will find in the Grand Grimoire and other texts many things about invoking dreams or getting prophetic dreams. That's one of the most central parts of the PGM, right? So definitely valid field of correlation or research. Yes.
I'm unfortunately I'm not as convinced that it was in some way like as linear as Jake makes it out to be. I think a lot of it was probably just accidental. But I see what Jake was trying to do. I think Jake was as much of a poet as he was a historic researcher, and Jake does really great work. Like, I'm not saying that Jake didn't put the work in. He did a really good job. It's just I don't see the Greek Goetis stuff there as much as he really puts in, and he does a really good job. I just think that it's more incidental and accidental than it is. But that's just my opinion. I am not as good a researcher as Jake, at all. I'm not as good a researcher.
Oh no! See, I think the one stream that tends to repeat is because of necromancy. Necromancy is the common thread that connects things, because almost every culture, right, again, from the Greeks to modern age, have had forms of necromancy. And you will find, like, even in the Grand Grimoire, there's a section on working with the dead. You go, in fact, that's one of the reasons they move the midnight mass, as it were, an hour or two back, because they didn't really want people doing necromancy at midnight. And so that's, something to consider. Yeah, the church knew this was happening, and they were like kind of trying ways to prevent it. Yes.
That is fascinating. Yeah. If this stuff is fascinating to you and you have not read Encyclopedia Goetica, you owe it to yourself. Jake's work is astounding. And those series of books, while I think I have issues with some of the conclusions that Jake draws from them, they're minor issues. It's a wonderful read. They're so brilliant. I miss Jake. I think Jake was doing such fantastic work, and we owe a debt of gratitude to Jake for the work that he did, particularly for making Blue Grimoires. I'm not going to say he made them hip again, but he's like, oh, we actually should look at how impactful these cheaply produced Blue Grimoires are. And there's no person other than Jake that did that. It's one person that made us try and relook at these crappy paperbacks that are kind of confusing, poorly made. And that's Jake. Jake did such a good job. And I miss him. I know you probably miss him as well.
Yeah. Total loss.
Yeah, it really was. Let's put a blue wrapper on this whole thing. Let's try to wrap this episode up. But so what to you is the enduring legacy of these things called Blue Grimoires?
Sure. So, essentially they are a cultural record, right? They're a cultural record of practices and, the cultural context. So if you look at the language or the kinds of things they're talking about, it's early firearms, right? Or it's garter belts or boots that you cannot travel long distances. So that's one of the critical legacies, right? There is indeed this preservation of knowledge that probably only we care about, magic spells that are very effective and so on. So these magical techniques and summoning, but the cultural knowledge is important. The second is really the scholarly value of being able to compare, texts and conversational artifacts and myths and, cultural beliefs with the whole principle of the way these books were being produced and distributed, which literally has had a long-lasting effect in distribution channels and the whole franchisee system, as it were, right? As for practical magicians, they're easy enough to tap into, experiment with. You don't need to go through many levels of initiation. I mean, you can literally just take those and try them out. There's no lodge system, as it were, prohibiting that. And so that's I would say the second most relevant thing. It's Hadean Press has this beautiful collection of guides to the underworld. There's individual slim pamphlets. Jake did quite a few, and there's many great texts, and they're also bundled together. And so saints and so on. I'd recommend those as a close enough substitute. And as I mentioned, I mean, many of the fairy tales and like the Huan and stuff are still extremely popular. They're you'll see them in different anthologies and collections. What the Grimm brothers did in their exercise moving across Germany and bits of Italy to collect and create that is in many ways thanks to the the Blue Grimoire tradition, even though it's in a different genre, because they couldn't have done it if that knowledge hadn't kind of spread and propagated. Although, to be very precise, they were capturing what they claimed was oral traditions, and putting them down on paper, but in reality, I mean, it was already, people had already started printing and reading. So they weren't truly doing pure oral ab initio work in a field that nobody had ever done it, but that's okay,
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely very, I would say, influential. Looking forward to, I think, a whole collection that someday, in our text. The University of Chicago, you mentioned, right, has a great set of books out there already. Yeah.
Yeah, they've got it'll be in the show notes, everybody. It's kind of a hard to look at website, but it's called the Artful Project. That's ARTFL Project. You can go there. You can look at some of the scans. There's not going to be a ton of grimoires there, everybody, but don't panic. Doug's got your back in the show notes to this episode. I'll find a lot of the grimoires. You can look at them. I'll have scans of quite a few of them. Not every single one of them, but quite a few of them will be there. Some of them, like the Enchiridion, I believe, is listed in a book called Cross Keys by Scarlet Imprint.
Michael Ciccatelli. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So I won't have that one up there, but quite a few of these I will have scans of. So head to the show notes for that one. Yeah. But I want to ask you, why are blue grimoires important for people nowadays? People listening to this right now, why should they care about blue grimoires?
Simply put, because they're easy to access, right? And they're easy to adapt. Those spells, right? Just to take that bit, are so simple and straightforward. You can adapt them to the modern context, right? You can just try them out, create your own, and leverage them. So I would say that's the simple direction. I mean, even if you're not planning to do a whole comparative reference against versions, they're just easy to operate with, right? The Petit Albert or the Grand Grimoire. Yes.
I'm going to get onto my soapbox here so bear with me, but I think what is fascinating about blue grimoires and why people nowadays need to know about them is that they start from a very consumerist basis. They were there to start people reading and wanting them so that a publishing company could make money. And what occurred is that people wanted them because they were mysterious and because they were fanciful and because they had things like summoning spirits to look for treasure. Everybody wanted to be part of this whole process. And what happened is that not only did it spread magic, but it spread things like literacy across a whole enormous landscape and even into the New World. Wherever the French traveled, the Bibliothèque Bleue went with them. And that is such an crazy, amazing, interesting thing. But there's also something that we need to realize about this is that just because people were trying to make money from these things, which is a really cynical way of looking at it, but it's true. It's cynical, but true. It ultimately helps the continuum of magic. This marketable aspect actually helped magic. So as much as we can be here and be like, I hate capitalism, it sucks, I get it. But magic has always been tied to money. Always. From the get-go. Magic is about getting laid and getting paid, as Sam Block says. And the people that produce these things are the same. They want to make money as well, but you want to engage in it. So there's this thing to sit with when you look at Bibliothèque Bleue historically, is this dance between the fashionability of magical fads and the spread of magic. And it's really cool to see because it's happening right now as well. There's a lot of books being produced now by certain authors, and I'm not saying I enjoy their work or don't enjoy their work, but it's very fatty. It's fad-ish is probably the word that I should say.
Gallery of magic.
Yeah. There's things that are being produced now that I get it. I get why people want to do these things. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm just glad that there's more magic. Truly, I'm just glad that people want to do this stuff and get engaged in it. I believe magic is real. I'm trying to give it its real history, and therefore I want to see magic in more places. Bibliothèque Bleue is one of the first instances we saw where people wanted to grab these things. They wanted to pay pennies to get this stuff, and magic flourished because of it. The other thing is this idea of novelty within magic, particularly literary novelty. My stance on such things, such as like the Kybalion, has softened a wee bit. Mitch Horowitz put out an essay not too long ago about giving novelty some credence and some space within the contemporary need and want for contextualizing magic historically. While I don't think that the Kybalion is hermetic in any way. It is a novel piece of writing. The Bibliothèque Blue, while most people that got them never engaged in magic at all, they just had them. That curiosity was enough for these texts to proliferate. And at the end of the day, when we look back, putting them in their context, magic was served right. There is something to that spark of curiosity, of illicitness, wanting to possess something magical and perhaps even a little bit taboo. And all it would cost you would be a very small amount. I can remember the way that I felt when I got my first copy of the Simonomicon when I was in grade 10. I'd heard about it. A friend had purchased it and said, oh, it's this really evil, crazy book of magic and spells and rituals. Remember that movie, The Evil Dead, where they talk about the Necronomicon? You can actually buy it. You can actually get a copy. And so I went out and I went to a chain bookstore because, of course, they would have an arcane text there. And I bought myself the Necronomicon, or as we call it nowadays, the Simonomicon. Was by an anonymous author. It starts off with these really crazy stories about bad things that happened to the author when he was trying to translate it. It's got these weird seals and sigils in it. And truly, it was baby's first grimoire. It was my first grimoire. This book felt dangerous. It felt magical, but more than anything, it made me want to engage in magic. It made my world magical again, and a little bit dangerous, and a little bit scary. All of the things that I love about this thing called magic. Of course, the spells and the rituals within that book, the Necronomicon, I never tried them. I never did anything with them. The mere having the book itself was almost an act of magic. Just the way that it played with my emotions, the way it made me feel, the way it made me want to take part in something. Well, that feeling that I had, I'm sure that some of you have had it as well. That is what these Bibliothèque Blue Grimoires did, I'm sure. And even if these books, for the most part, a lot of them are very impractical. You can't do the magic from them. You can try. I don't know how successful you're going to be, particularly something like the Black Pullet. Good luck. Have fun. But the novelty of these grimoires that make people want to do this stuff is also an important aspect of magic. It is something worth sitting with. The very fantastic and fanciful things that get produced in the name of one trying to do ritual magic is important. And it is best encapsulated within the Bibliothèque Blue. So I don't know if you'd agree with that at all, but I'll get off my soapbox.
No, that's spot on, right? Like you were saying, capitalism is about what sells, right? And what sells is what works, or at least people believe it works. And so the reason we have the continuity is people were buying these things, exchanging them, collecting them, wanting them. And so that has led to the continuity or transmission of that knowledge to the stage where we can now apply it or experiment with it. And yeah, so that's awesome. Yeah.
Oh, well, I really want to thank you for coming on to What Magic Is This and talking about this, Aaman, because it's been so fascinating. Yeah. Let's talk about what's going on with you. So we talked a bit about the Grand Grimoire. I love the Grand Grimoire. It's a fantastic work. Everybody, please pick it up. You just released a book from Haitian Press, and you were kind enough to send me a copy. The Magical Art. Please tell the listeners about this incredible document. I was just going to say as well before you begin here, it's beautiful. It's a really well done. I love the color. I love the retouched up illustrations and the fact that you also have the original illustrations in there as well. That's so fascinating. Tell us about why this is a really cool book. Really cool.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it's been just so entertaining and enjoyable to be on your show. I mean, I think you're doing a fabulous service. You're great. You've got that, the knowledge and the confidence of sharing it, which is very important. So yeah, I'm constantly working on text. I mean, I have like 2 or 3 written, and so you'll see them come out over this year, next year. This is especially dear to me for many reasons, right? This began in the days of the when we were all kind of cloistered with the COVID years, and we had to, do a lot of conversations, Zoom conversations and stuff. And so the Goetia Grimoire groups, and with Stian Kulstein and Michael Lux and Michael Sohan and so on, and especially David Rankine and Jake Stratton-Kent, and we were all talking about many of these texts and grimoires, and it was, one of the, with Jake's special interest in the Grimoire Verum, or the True Grimoire, we discussed it and what were its potential sources and prior manuscripts. I think everyone knew, as it were, that there were various texts, including this one specifically called the MS 983. And so I kind of, volunteered or took on the task of beginning to look at it and worked through on it I'd say very hard over, like 2.5, 3 years. Reviewing many aspects of it with many people, including Jake. He was kind enough with his time. We exchanged a lot of stuff. He was also willing to see that certain interpretations in the Grimoire Verum might be in fact kind of superseded by these, because again, this is an earlier text, right?
Right.
So from my perspective, this is another foundational text, right? We're really lucky that we live in this time that we can have access to these restored texts. And as I mentioned, this is a specific manuscript, MS 983, which is part of the Wellcome collection, right? This was the Wellcome Trust was actually, and again, going back to capitalism, founded by an American pharmaceutical magnate, right?
Right.
And he collected a lot of texts, books, open for review. They're digitized, many of them. I was actually able to trace the original bookshop that's potentially sold this text to Henry Wellcome, because there was a small kind of pencil note in the inside cover, and it came from a place called the Lafitte Marseille, which is really the Libraire Lafitte. So it's a bookstore in Marseille, established in about 1846, right? And so not too far back from where these books were being published. And it claims to date back to 1309, but very obviously it has references to 16th century texts and America and stuff. So it's probably 1709, right? It is indeed part of the Solomonic tradition, right? And so in that sense, it's you could trace it back to the Testament of Solomon, but more closely to the Little Key of Solomon, or the Grand Grimoire, right? And its structure is somewhat unusual. This manuscript is missing the critical part 2. Those supernatural secrets are not in this, right? Right. But it's replaced with some other very interesting things, right? It's quite obviously a working magician's text, a French magician from Paris, very familiar with the region of Paris. And the hierarchy of spirits here is again under Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Astaroth. But the spirits are really similar to those in the Grimoire Verum as opposed to the Grand Grimoire, although there is an overlap with the ones in the Grand Grimoire, right? And then the Goetia, which is part of the Lemegeton. Now, what's interesting is that it adds to that with certain very fine variations. For example, the Sanctum Regnum has a certain prayer, right, which replaces the tetragrammaton with the pentagrammaton, right? That tells us that this is quite clearly a something part of the Christian Kabbalah or the Protestant tradition, because that you can almost look at that. That's basically the fourfold name of Yahweh with the shin introduced to make it Yeshua, right? And you can look at that in Pico della Mirandola's writings and so on. It references the Heptameron, or there's a complete text of the Heptameron in here, of which Joseph Peterson's done the most excellent Lucidarium edition. But what I found in this manuscript, which isn't, as far as I can tell, in other manuscripts, is a complete additional ritual to Maimon, right? The king of Saturday, potentially the Jinn king, but we're going to leave that aside. And it has other rituals. Yeah. So onimancy, right? So that's fingernail scrying, which dates back as early as the Sumerians, right? And the Babylonians. So you're really looking into pretty deep. Finally, and I'm somewhat pleased with this. When I was translating, there was a section on the Shem HaMephorash, or the 72 angels. I was actually surprised when was working through this with my good friend, a scholar and occultist and linguist Bal Kedmon, that there were many mistakes, right, in the Shem HaMephorash. And then we, look further and you find the same mistakes in the names of the angels in Rud and so on, right? Now, Dr. Skinner has indeed corrected most of these, but what I thought would be helpful is in an appendix, I've given a pretty rigorous, history of the Shem HaMephorash, and corrected, let me say, names and sources of the 72 angels, most of which I think, as we know, come from Exodus 14, 17 to 19, except one of them, which comes from Genesis 1:1. So that's an interesting thread to follow up as to why it does. But overall, it's so beautifully produced by Hadean Press. I'm like truly delighted and honored to have it in this excellent, the hardcover is almost sold out. The paperbacks kind of doing extremely well is from what I hear. So I'm really excited by this. And a little note, this is actually volume 1. So there is a second volume coming maybe later this year, maybe early next year, remains to be seen with the vagaries of publication. That is something else. I'll save on what that is, but that's going to be as interesting and push things back maybe a little further.
For sure. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. And I should say, sorry, it is, of course, dedicated with deep respect to Jake Stratton Kent. He was kind enough to also write the foreword. So I'm very proud, right, of the magical art.
Yeah, I think he might be maybe the last time he gave a foreword.
Maybe it's
when I saw he did the foreword, I was like, oh wow,
yes,
that's amazing. It is a beautiful book, and Aaman did talk about the Shem HaMephorash. I think what's most interesting that will serve people that are curious about the 72 angels, and again, people that are familiar with something, say like the Goetia of Dr. Rudd that was put up by Skinner and Rankin, is that there's the thwarting angels that are those are the angels of the Shem HaMephorash. What Aaman has done here is he's listed the how the names are made. So for people that are trying to know how the angels got their names to the Shem HaMephorash, he goes through it, and it's so cool. So it's worth that alone. The appendix alone is worth the price of admission.
Right.
Everybody grab a copy. The Magical Art by Hadean Press.
And as you can see, fantastic. It's a syncretic mix. I mean, you've got
so-called
grimoire, within quotes demons. You've got angels. You've got rituals with the days of the week and stuff. So I mean, that's amazing. That shows the versatility really of magic as a discipline. Yeah,
I love working grimoires. Working grimoires are my favorite. Like I like Bibliothèque Blue. I like that stuff because you're seeing somebody work through something, and it's so fascinating to me. What next? What's going on in your world? What's
Well, there's always something new. I mean, I've got good work stuff going on. I was honored to be included by the Marquee Who's Who this year. In their nice collection. So cool. Yay me. Nice. I've got the the Song of Oberon foreword by Daniel Harms, who did, of course, the excellent Book of Oberon, will be coming out later this year. Amazing, beautiful art by my dear artist wife, Deepthi Lamba. You're going to love that, right? It's in the classical tradition of illumination and illustration. Awesome. So that's going to be so beautiful. And we'll talk more about that when that's out. There's this, volume 2 of this, and there's some couple more books next year. We'll see, right, how things go. And lots of practical magic. Got to keep the spirits fed. Santa Muerte and all of them. Very excited to keep going. And I mean, so thank you for having me on. I mean, this is definitely been great. Yeah.
You got to keep busy, man. Otherwise, idle hands are the Lucifuge Rofocal's playthings, right? Like that's how it goes. Indeed. Amazing. Yeah. I love your work, and it's really fantastic. I'm excited for what comes next. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm considering I should have a proper website soon, but for now, Twitter Aaman Lamba or Facebook aamanlamba.author are the best places. You can reach me again, aamanlamba@gmail.com. My books are on amazon.com. And of course, the magical art is beautifully produced and available on Hadean.press, their new website.
Right.
So I would point you all there. They, and in many noted bookstores. So get it where you like it. Leave a review. If you'd like to speak about it, happy to discuss it. I think it's got thousands of, as Wilmore mentioned, it's got more footnotes than Ingvi Malmsteen's stage boots have, rivets on stage, right? So definitely, it's got a lot going there. Yes.
For sure.
Okay, but thank you so much. Yeah.
No problem. Everybody, please find Aaman's work, and it's exceptional stuff. And that's Blue Grimoires. Also, Haitian Press. I love their new website, but by all means, Aaman was entirely correct that their guides to the underworld are basically like there are generations Bibliothèque Blue. They're really great. Head there. There'll be some in the show notes. I'll just link to their website in the show notes, everybody. There's going to be something there I know you're going to want to read. And you can pick up a digital version for like $3. They're pennies. So it's just like the Bibliothèque Blue. They're cheap, they're affordable. Sometimes they're like 25 pages. They're small. You can read it in less than one sitting. Yeah, they're fantastic. The Haitian Press Guide to the Underworlds are amazing. I absolutely love them. I will have links to all of Aaman's work, where to find his books, as well as where to find him on the internet, and there'll be some show notes for this episode. But as I mentioned, if there is one book that one should buy for this series of magical books that I'm doing for the months of September and October on What Magic Is This, Owen Davies's Grimoires, A History of Magical Books, put out by Oxford Publishing, is the book to grab. It is fantastic. It's got a lot of stuff about Blue Grimoires in there. Bibliothèque Bleue is in that book. Some wonderful stories, including that one that I related of the murder of that poor person in Barbados, so that the murderers could basically create a hand of glory from the Petit Albert so that they could rob a bank. That story, as well as many great stories, are within that book. Please grab that book. It's really, really great. But I will also have links to a lot of the copies and scans of Bibliothèque Bleu Grimoires, as well as translations in the show notes for this episode. You can find those at whatmagicisthis.com. Please head there. There's some great things there. And be sure to grab something from Aaman as well, including, and definitely grab the Grand Grimoire. It's really, really cool. So do you think that I'm doing something kind of cool here on What Magic Is This, and you'd like to show your support in some way? Well, I would love for you to support. And there's a couple ways of doing this. Let's go through all of them. I promise I won't take too long for this one, but we'll give it a shot. The first and best way of supporting me, in the way that it pays my bills, it makes me do this thing that I love to do, which is podcasting, as my full-time job, and that is through Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any number of the Patreon links there. It is only $7 American a month. That is peanuts. That is nothing. And it goes to support me, and I create all of these wonderful, crazy, great podcast episodes there. I do videos as well. It's basically a different version of What Magic Is This. It's got a lot of my opinions. It's got a lot of really instructional things in how I look at magic and how I contextualize it and what books I love, as well as entities. I just finished an episode and released an episode on the Patreon last week, which would be September of 2024, with the one and only Sam Block, or Polyphanes. I had him on to talk about the god Hermes, and Hermes is such a fascinating Greek god. In fact, let's play a little bit of that episode for you here, because I want you to listen to it. And again, I think that my greatest stuff is on the Patreon, and there's an interview with the one and only Sam Block on the Patreon as well. Here's a little sample of it to entice you to try and come and support me on the Patreon. Here's a Sam Block on Hermes. I started researching this one god, and then, of course, as I normally do, whenever I start researching, I was like, I think the great Polyphanes has talked about this, and then do a search on Digital Ambler, and it's like, oh yeah, I forgot that Sam is devotional to this certain god, this certain deity. Let's jump right in, Sam. So, who is this Hermes fella?
Hermes is great. So we all know Hermes by a variety of names: Mercury or Mercurius, Hermes, maybe Thoth or Thoth, or Jehuti if you want to use the more Egyptian name. I like using the Greek name because I do consider him first and foremost a Greek deity. In the mythic stories, Hermes is the son of the great god Zeus and the nymph Maya. Uh, there's a number of hymns written about him in his history, but we can basically summarize the many things of Hermes as he is a god of travelers, roads, those who go places, those who go between places, trade and commerce, trickery, magic, divination, astrology, prayer and sacrifice, of the gym, of shepherds and shepherding animals. He's has a lot of different aspects to him, which kind of attests to how ancient of a god he is and how much he's kind of subsumed, which of course only got bigger as time went on with, you know, flirting with the Romans, flirting with the Egyptians, having his cult spread beyond Greece throughout the rest of the Mediterranean, especially into more modern times when we associate him also with the planet Mercury,
Right.
through Hellenistic and Babylonian influence, which also increased his, domains, as it were. Who is Hermes? He's big.
He's big.
He's big.
To this day. All right, so that was a nice short little snippet there to give you a sweet little taste of the genius that is Sam Block, and talking about Hermes, and it goes in some very interesting places and some very fascinating concepts. And if you love Sam's work, as I know you do at Digital Ambler, you really should check out this episode. It's on the Patreon. Again, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. $7, that's nothing. It's a totally different show, and it's really quite wonderful. And that's where I would love to see you supporting what I do here at What Magic Is This. Also, I've said it many places, but I'll say it again. I want to thank Sam so much for coming on the Patreon and doing that episode. I really appreciate it. He's the absolute best. And head to digitalambler.com and support and see what Sam gets up to there, because we're so lucky that he's alive and doing the stuff that he's doing. Also, if you don't feel like doing the Patreon supporting of me and you'd like to throw me some cash, $5, $10, $20, $100, $200,000, I can have a PayPal account. Just go to whatmagicisthis.com, click on any number of the PayPal buttons you see there. They're like two Ps. They're both different shades of blue. Just click it, and you can give me any chunk of change. It all goes to help this podcast run. It pays the bills. I got a lot of costs on this podcast, and so the PayPal just goes into paying for the bills and the costs of running this show and hoping that it sounds as good as it does all the time. The third way of supporting me is a very new and, dare I say, quite brilliant way of supporting What Magic Is This, in that I have a bookshop. Of course, I recommend a ton of books on What Magic Is This. We just finished an episode about talking about books, and you better believe your boots that those books are going to be in the show notes to this episode, and those are also going to be in my virtual online bookstore that is done through bookshop.org. So what they are is they are a way for a ton of independent bookstores all across North America to support one another, and they sell books online and they'll ship them to you, and the people selling the books get a little bit of cash, and me for recommending these books to you because I know you want to read these books, I know you want to have them in your hand. I get a small little chunk of change. I get $2 or $3 every time you buy a book through my virtual bookshop, and so there's a couple of ways of getting to that bookstore. Let's go through it. The first way is just going straight there with the web address. That's bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis, all one word. That will take you to my online virtual bookshop store. You'll see that it is divided with every single episode has their list of books there. Some books, they have like 12 books that I've listed in the show notes, and some episodes just have one. This one, hopefully there'll be quite a few. And what you do is just click on the books there and then order the book. Another way of doing it is heading to whatmagicisthis.com and just going to my show notes there. And anytime I talk about a book that is also listed through bookshop.org, just click that link and that'll take you to Bookshop. Make sure that you see my little banner there, What Magic Is This? The Bookshop is there. And then if you order the book, that helps me as well. But the major reason to do this is to to help the independent bookstores and to help me a little bit. I don't see a ton of money from it, but I do like to see you ordering books, and I do love spreading the love that is books, because if you did not listen to the last episode, this whole thing is about this stuff spreads because of books and wanting books and purchasing books, and that is the major contributing factor to this continuum of magic, despite what a lot of people will say. It truly is, within the West, a literary tradition more than anything, and those things are grimoires. And you can purchase grimoires through the What Magic Is This bookshop. So head to my website, go there as well. You'll find the links to my bookstore. Just click on the side menu there, and you'll see a big button. You can see Cyprian there. Just click that link, and then you'll head to my bookshop, or go to the web address. That's bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis, or just go to my website in those show notes and click on the book, and there you go. I would love to see you grabbing some books, because books are fucking fantastic, are they not? And the last way of showing your support is grabbing some merchandise. So grabbing a t-shirt, hoodies, tote bags, fridge magnets, stickers, coffee mugs, all of those. Head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the menu, go to merchandise. It's there on the side menu there. Click that, and you'll head to my TeePublic store. All kinds of things. I've got great designs there. I just uploaded a design with a little skull candy jar, and it's really quite wonderful. I would love to see you grab some merch. I don't see very much money. I see even less from these than I do the bookshop stuff, but I love seeing people wearing this stuff. Somebody just sent me that they got 3 t-shirts. Thank you so much for grabbing those t-shirts. I absolutely love it. And yeah, I hope you look spiffy. I know you look spiffy in them, but if you, listener, want to look as spiffy as this person that just bought 3 t-shirts, then grab yourself some t-shirts or a hoodie or a long sleeve. Truly, the long sleeve shirts look so dope. I forget what they're called, like baseball tees or something like that. But you know, the kind of like 3/4 length t-shirts, those are dope. I used to wear those back in the 80s. That's right, I was alive in the 80s. I remember them. I know some of you do. Not all of you, but I know some of you do. I certainly do. Great times, from what I remember. Anyhow, so if you want to grab some merchandise, best way of doing that, whatmagicisthis.com, click the merchandise button. I don't see a lot of money from them, but I hope you like them. I hope you enjoy them. But again, the best way of supporting me is either through the Patreon, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or through PayPal, or through the bookshop. That is bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis. But all of these links and everything that I've talked about, including Aaman's books, everything will be available at the show notes to this episode at whatmagicisthis.com. Head there. I know you'll love it. Blue Grimoires, everybody. I hope you really enjoyed this. Aaman, thank you so much.
Thank you
for coming on the show. And yeah, I can't wait to see what you do next. That's the Blue Grimoires. That's Bibliothèque. Bleu. I hope everybody's fingertips are all blue right now from that sugar.
And cheesy, right? Blue cheese.
Cheesy, blue. There we go. Blue and cheesy, everybody. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Please and tune in to the next episode. We got one more in the Books of Magic series, and trust me, it's going to be a really great one. You won't want to miss it. But until then, I want each and every one of you listening to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. We will talk at each of every one of you soon. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.